Hey everybody, Mr. Moppin coming at you again with another APGov video. Taking a look today at topic 3.12, which is working on balancing minority and majority rights. Now previously, when we've talked about civil rights, last time we were talking about major achievements in the fight for civil rights, especially when you're talking about matters of racial equality. So we talked about things, for example, like the 24th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act. Now, one can kind of take a look at those major accomplishments, which they are, but keep in mind that it does not end the challenges that are still going to be associated with issues regarding civil rights based on race and ethnicity. And once again, it's important to kind of set the context for where a lot of these challenges lie. You have to remember that starting after the Civil War, the South is going to almost, easily transition into this Jim Crow segregated society, where on paper it might seem like people of color had rights, but in reality those rights simply did not exist in terms of access to equal public accommodations, the ability to vote, things like that. And no, this is going to be established after the Civil War, and it's going to be continued and reinforced for a few more generations after that. So you're talking about nearly 100 years. And in fact, the Supreme Court is going to be seemingly in support of segregation with the infamous Plessy versus Fergus decision in 1896 that basically stipulated that, yes, you could have segregation and not violate the 14th Amendment equal protection laws as long as the facilities are quote-unquote, equal. But as we know in reality, segregation was designed to prevent real equality in society, and that in reality it actually promotes great inequality. Now, of course, this was overturned. This primary principle of separate but equal gets overturned in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Now, note, for many of us, when we think of Brown versus Board of Education, and the court makes a very clear statement that you cannot have segregated public schools based on race and not violate the Equal Protection Clause. And so when we hear that ruling and we hear that opinion, or we read that opinion, it seems very straightforward. It seems like, oh, okay, you have to desegregate schools. Schools must begin to be integrated, and boom, it's going to start to happen because the courts have, made this ruling. Well, you got to remember, to try to undo these generations in the South of strict racial white supremacy and segregationist policies, Southern governments are not going to just simply, look at the ruling of Brown versus Board and go, oh, okay, thanks for the clarification. We'll begin to integrate the schools immediately. And that is going to necessitate a second Brown versus Board of Education case where the original ruling simply says that when you have public schools that are segregated, you are violating equal protection under the law. And that's kind of what the court left it at. And for many of us, once again, we kind of look at it and go, okay, we know what this means. But Southern states are going to use that, lack of emphatic clarification to go, oh, okay, it just says that we're in violation of the Constitution. So what? The court does not explicitly order us to integrate, and that's what Brown versus Board of Education does. The court rules that the desegregation process had to happen with, quote, all deliberate speed. Not, when it's comfortable to you, but it needs to start now. But still, though, school districts in southern states are still going to be slow to enforce this. Remember, courts don't have their own enforcement mechanism. They have to rely on executive branches at either the federal and or state level to make the rulings actually have effect. And in many southern states, they got no assistance from the executive branch. One such example would be at Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. The governor there, a guy by the name of Orville Faubus, is going to refuse to integrate Central High School when 9 students attempt to enroll. In fact, he uses the Arkansas Guard to make sure that those African American students do not enroll in the school. Now, this then brings a very interesting question in terms of, will southern states be able to just flaunt and ignore the Supreme Court's ruling? Well, Dwight Eisenhower will make the decision, with especially a lot of pressure on him by civil rights groups to do so. Eisenhower will send in the 101st Airborne to escort those 9 students into the school to begin to integrate that district. Now, it is a very important, thing for the president to say on this very controversial issue at the time, that, hey, I've got your back, Supreme Court. You've made this ruling, and I'm going to enforce it. But note, though, this is still not going to end the legal shenanigans that many southern states are going to be implementing to really, at the end of the day, delay, drag out, muddy the waters in the process of truly just integrating the schools. For example, you had lawsuits that were filed by southern states that would say, well, hey, the court has said that we had to desegregate with all deliberate speed. So, okay, we're not going to have rules on the books that say that you have to segregate, but what if it just kind of happens naturally? Desegregation may not necessarily mean the same thing as forced integration. That, in other words, you can say you can't segregate, but it doesn't mean that you can make people integrate, right? Well, an example of one of these many stalling tactics in the late 1960s, note, a full decade after the Brown versus Board of Education rulings, is going to be the freedom of choice policies that are going to emerge in many southern states, which are going to be basically telling families in a given school district, particularly an urban school district, okay, here are our schools in the district. Here's the ones that are closest to you. You choose the schools you want to go to. And what they found, and no, this is what they, assumed what would happen, is that since these communities were already de facto segregated due to the legacy of de jure segregation, that families made their priority in terms of having their kids attend the closest schools to where they lived. And so what ended up happening is that even though there's no forced segregation by law or anything, the result of segregation is still going to exist. You're still going to see white kids going to an overwhelmingly white school, black kids going to an overwhelmingly black school, based on the de facto segregation of where they were living in the first place. And so this was done again to try to, keep the schools from mitigating. Once again, it's going to require lawsuits in the Supreme Court to intervene and say, no, you can't have these freedom of choice policies. The court's going to, basically going to be dragged into having to more and more explicitly say, listen, you have to actively integrate. You actually have to take positive steps to integrate the schools, because when you don't integrate the schools, you are going to have segregation. And segregation, be it by law or by reality, is going to prove inequitable to minority students. Now, that being said, it's going to be that general sentiment is going to be reinforced in the 1971 Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg case, which is going to tell states and school districts that in a given school district, you have to make an active attempt to try to have racial ratios for every school in a given district in line with the racial makeup of the population of the district itself. So, in other words, if it is a 60% white, 40% black, school district in terms of the population of the residents there, then the schools need to try their active best to keep the schools at approximately 60% white, 40% black. Now, the reason for this is obviously integration, promotes equity. But the question, though, is how do you achieve those ratios when people have already segregated based on where they live? Well, one of the answers to this dilemma is what's going to be known as forced busing. The idea being is that in a large school district, you think of like a big urban school district, that you would take students that are living in a predominantly white neighborhood and you bus some of them to the predominantly black neighborhood, and vice versa. Students from a predominantly black neighborhood, having them attend school where it's a primarily white population. And so you do this long distance busing within a given city to then force the integration. Now, note, the forced busing policies are going to be very well principled, but they're going to be highly unpopular with residents in the cities, particularly white residents. The idea being is that, white residents are going to say, I live in this neighborhood because I want my kids to attend, X school. And, what's the point of living in this neighborhood if I'm still going to be forced to go to another school across town that I didn't want my child to go to in the first place? So there's going to be tremendous protests in many cities in the 1970s with the use of forced busing. Ultimately, forced busing is never really going to be effective in forcing the integration that districts are going to be looking for. And part of what's going to stymie the integration efforts in schools, in part, is going to be due to what we call white flight. Starting in the 1960s, really, when we start to see what is going to be the end of forced segregation and, more integrated schools and more integrated neighborhoods, you're going to start to see middle-class and wealthier white families beginning to move out of urban areas. So, for example, moving out of the city of Cincinnati itself and moving out to what are going to be emerging suburban areas. So back in the 1960s, you're looking at places like Montgomery and Blue Ash and Springdale and Sharonville and Glendale and, places like that. And when those folks moved out there, these were pretty rural areas at the time, and it had overwhelmingly white populations. And so you had the growth of these suburbs with white to wealthy middle-class folks moving out there, and what that does is take out a lot of the white population that was in the urban areas. And therefore, you're taking what had been, a more biracial, urban population and now making it overwhelmingly people of color. And so even when you try to have racial ratios that are equal, if 80% of your city is made up of people of color, it's still going to be segregated no matter how you balance the schools within a given district. Also add to the mix was a growing desire for folks that didn't want to leave the city to begin to attend private schools, including Catholic parochial schools. We also saw the creation of certain magnet schools as being an option that some white parents, promoted. The idea being is that you base a school's admission in a district based on testing into the school. In other words, drawing the most academically talented students to a school. And that generally tended to have more white majority student population. So there were all sorts of things that were used to try to keep, schools from truly integrating. And today we still have, in many respects, a de facto segregated school system across the country. The vast majority of students that are white attend overwhelmingly white schools, and the vast majority of students that are of color attend schools that are overwhelmingly schools with populations of students of color. And so, the question then becomes, how do you achieve the goals of an integrated school system, knowing what segregation, be it by law or by reality, will inherently create? How do you do that while at the same time protecting people's rights to live where they want to live and, be able to, say, I want to move into this district or move into this neighborhood based on my private personal desires to do so. So these are challenging circumstances that, really have been difficult for the last, many, many decades. So we'll leave it there with education issues for civil rights. When we come back, we'll do another video taking a look at issues regarding civil rights challenges in the voting booth. Okay? But we'll do that next time. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.